One of the regular features of our program is updates and changes that come from the province, and once again we have with us our Chief Veterinary Officer, Dr. Betty Althouse, and she is going to update us on what is being changed or proposed to be changed. And I told her to warn her to make sure that she's got her flak vest on like she always does. We're gonna go at it again. So with that, I'll turn the mic over to Betty and let her explain what's coming.
Thank you. I thought I heard you say one of the irregular things that you have is updates from us, so I hope that wasn't it, but it's over the irregular presentation.
Irregular is Brad, Betty.
Thank you. I'm happy to have the opportunity to be here today. Just before I get started, I do want to introduce a new and important staff member in our unit. And we have Trent Catley, who started just March 1st as the Manager of Regulatory Compliance. So he's overseeing the game farm and meat inspection programs. So Trent, just maybe stand up so people can see him. So you will remember Sheila Copeland was the previous person in the position. She went back to being a diagnostic pathologist at PDS the end of October, I guess. And so we've just managed to get the position staffed then March 1st. So having just had a month on the job, we didn't make Trent come and talk to you today, but he's here, and make sure you say hi. So what I want to do is just take the opportunity to run through the proposed changes to game farm regulations. We've had some in-person meetings. We sent out a package to all licensed game farms a couple months ago. We had meetings offered the end of February and early March for in-person feedback. We didn't have great turnout at those meetings, but we had good discussions with the people that were there. We are asking anybody who is interested to please return the survey, the written survey. We're accepting the feedback until April 15th. So hopefully, if you haven't already sent in your responses, and I think only about 30 or 35 have, and we've had about 14 or 15, I think, attend in person. So anybody who hasn't responded and is interested in doing so, please get back. And I'm going to just, again, just briefly run through what the proposed changes are today. Again, we'll capture your comments today. And we are looking, I guess, for feedback as well from the industry groups as well, sort of as official feedback there. So as we go through, I will kind of highlight what we've heard so far from the ones that we have heard from. So you'll remember we did do a consultation last fall on game farm regulations, and had planned to have new regulations in place by the end of 2017. But the Cabinet Committee that looks at regulations looked at the consultation time and some of the feedback, and we acknowledged that the consultation was through harvest. We had some delays in getting it out, so it didn't go out until September, and it had a somewhat short turnaround time, and we did get a lot of feedback that wasn't appropriate timing and that it was too short. So that's one of the reasons that we've gone with a longer period and through the winter months now. Some of the things that we had talked about in the previous regulatory package were removed. There was a proposal to have some timelines on recapturing escaped animals, and there was negative feedback on that, and so that was removed from the package. So one of the things that we were consulting on was license fees. We have been directed that they do want to reinstitute a license fee for game farms. Prior to 2010, there was a fee, it was I think $100 for, I think for 5 years at that point, or $100 a year. Yeah, and so it was removed in 2010. Again, desire to add a fee. The previous consultation, we had asked about $400 for a 2-year license, reduced to $200 for herds on the herd certification program. Again, we were asked to look at some other alternatives, such as longer periods of time and other alternatives. So this was what was the wording in the consultation package. I think what we've heard so far from people is that people do want a longer license, prefer a 5-year license. Having an option for 1 year for people that are just going to be in for a shorter time was also something that seemed to be relatively popular. As far as numbers, if we stuck with the $100 a year range, people seemed reasonably comfortable, although we've certainly heard from some that there shouldn't be any fee. Started to get up to the $200 a year phase, there was a fair bit of resistance and people generally expressing that was too much. In the in-person consultations, sort of ended up throwing out the idea of $100 a year or 5 years for $400 as maybe the alternative. So I guess if I sort of think about that, and when you provide your feedback, whether you think that would be reasonable or not. We also heard pretty strongly that there wasn't much support for a tiered fee, that people weren't interested in having a lower fee for herds on the VHCP. So if you think differently than that, I guess let us know. So any questions about fees or comments about fees before I move on to the next? Okay, so the next one that we'd looked into was the eligibility to apply for a license. So right now, just look at the ability to, or the for the initial application, it really just is an application, and then on renewals, it looks for how the license holder has been complying with the game farm regulations. We wanted to expand that to also look at compliance with some of the other acts that we oversee, such as the Animal Protection Act and the Diseases of Animals Act, so that if there was lack of compliance with welfare standards, or if there was lack of compliance with things like quarantines, that those could also be considered in deciding whether or not to renew a license. So I think, again, there wasn't a lot of discussion of that at the in-person sessions. I think people were generally comfortable with that. So I guess any further comments here?
I would see that if you ever try some of this with the cattle producers, the hog producers, you would have a huge pushback in licensing or having criteria for people to engage in farming practice. It seems to me this is rather discriminatory when it singles out cervid ranchers with this all of these hoops.
Mm-hmm. So and game farms, cervids, and it also includes some of the sheep species as well under the game farms. But there has been a review of the game farm program per se, and whether there was a need to continue to license them and treat them differently from other livestock. And because of the issue of the same species being farmed on both sides of the fence, and the concern about both disease and genetics and that sort of thing, that feel there is justification to continue to require licensing. And that was looked at as a program review a few years ago, and the government's decision was to continue to license game farms and fur farms. Any other questions? Okay, the other one then is the ability to put conditions on licenses. So right now, the licenses are issued. So we would, if we add the ability to put conditions on a license, this would mean that you could specify that requirements, and these would be requirements that are already included in the regulations, would have to be complied with as a condition of a license. So for example, it could be your license is renewed, but as a condition of your license, you have to conduct an inventory by this date, or you need to submit deaths over 12 months for chronic wasting disease testing. So it couldn't be conditions that we just make up in policy or add to. It has to be conditions that are already existing in the regulations, and just makes it clear on the license that these particular conditions need to be complied with. So it would be generally in a case where maybe up to that point there hasn't been full compliance with the regulations. So we're saying, yes, we'll still issue you a new license, but these conditions have to be met during the licensing period. So any...
Yeah, how much slippage on head submission are you gonna?
So that would be generally, when you make it conditions, that would be something that was fairly significant. So obviously we have not been up to date on inventories on every farm in the last while. We're trying to get all the ones that haven't been compliant back onto the programs and back into regularly doing inventories and that sort of thing. And until we have the inventories in place to balance, we're not even going to know whether the CWD submissions have been made, right? So that's the first step. And then under the surveillance program, there is an assessment that's made. And normally we just provide information back that says, you know, this is where you are deficient. So you'd start with that the first time. And then if it was continuing problems, then we might put more conditions on. But under our program, it's an 80% submission requirement is what we're looking for. Is 80% of the deaths are submitted, or they need to be somewhat timely. So if there was, you know, we had reports from your birth death reports and knew that there had been 50 animals slaughtered on farm, and we had no CWD submissions, that would be the kind of thing that, you know, submit the ones that are in your freezer and get them tested.
Yeah, but I don't, like, okay, so I submit 75% for whatever reason. What do you do then? What are you gonna do? Can you take my license and?
No, at that point you'd get a letter that would say why you're not compliant, and we'd be looking for better compliance. So this would be where people aren't submitting heads at all, for example, is where we'd be wanting to put it on a condition to the license. Again, it's just trying to have ways to address the people that haven't been complying with the program at all and bring them along.
Right, it's just hard to agree to things if you don't know where you're going with it.
Yeah, so we have developed a compliance policy that kind of outlines the, you know, sort of that stepwise process that we'll be looking at, and we can share that with the industry. I'm not sure yet whether we can put it on our website. That would be my preference, is that it's right there and available for everybody to see. If we can't put it on the website, we'll at least make sure it gets sent out to all the producers, so that you understand sort of that stepwise process that we're looking at. And that's the goal is really to bring people along and bring them into compliance. It's not trying to punish people or kick people out of the industry, but we do want to see people compliant, and we haven't had a lot of tools to help us do that. And so this is, you know, the conditions on license, and the next thing I talk about are just additional tools to help us bring people along.
And would these rules apply to hunt farm operations as well?
Yes, I mean it would be in the regulations right now. There's no difference. All farms they're just a licensed game farm. There's no different criteria for hunt farms or a breeding farm. There is some leeway certainly on the CWD surveillance program. Some of that's in policy and how it's applied, so I'll talk about some differences on hunt farm a little later. Okay, we'll go to the next one. So add the ability to be able to cancel a license. So up until a change in early 2017, we actually couldn't even suspend a license. But now, if someone is not compliant, we can suspend a license, and we would like to have the ability to cancel a license as well. It's very unusual in any sort of a compliance or regulatory framework where you don't have some ways to cancel a license. work in, say, the meat inspection program. There's the ability to cancel a license if people are continually non-compliant and haven't responded to other tools to try to bring them along. So we would like to, again, the ability to cancel a license, and again, it would be based on non-compliance with the acts and policies or conditions on the game farm license. So again, it would be a stepwise process. You'd start with the suspension, conditions on a license, outlining things that need to be done, and if those aren't done, or there's no progress or sort of no cooperation with that, then we would have the ability to actually cancel a license. Again, this isn't something that we're looking to do. It's sort of in those extreme cases as an option. So any questions on that? Again, on the both these last two, on the in-person consultations, there was generally pretty good support with that. Realize that there has to be some teeth, there has to be regulations, that people do want people to be following the regulations, and that there is some consequences for people who aren't. Again, that's sort of that level playing field. Okay. So I guess, and again, because once you've canceled a license, you need a way to orderly remove animals from that premises, or if someone chose to not renew a license, say because they were opposed to the fee or something like that, or they only had a few animals left and they didn't want to pay a license fee. Right now, if you're not licensed, then you fall under the captive wildlife regulations with Environment, Wildlife Act. So this would give an orderly way that animals could be removed from the farm. So we were proposing 6 months to have animals removed, or up to a year if there was, with approval in there, as long as there wasn't kind of a public health concern. And this is very similar to what was instituted in the fur farm regulations when we actually instituted a $500 a year fee. Some people were choosing not to renew their license at that time, so we have a 6-month orderly removal of the fur farm animals to make sure that there's an opportunity to find new homes or euthanize them or whatever. So I think from the feedback that we got at the in-person meetings is that, yes, recognize we need to have a process where you can don't immediately get kicked over to Environment when you don't have a license. Also recognition that just with the production methods, probably 1 year is the reasonable time period to do that it would be hard to necessarily do in 6 months. And so I think from the feedback that we've heard so far, we'll probably be looking at making it a 1 year transition time to dispose of animals if the license was canceled or not renewed. So any questions? Okay. So currently, if the only regulatory tool is suspending a license, and there are provisions in the regulations to have any suspension reviewed by the minister. So that's just an extra step, so that if for some reason I've gone mad with power and I'm overstepping my bounds and abusing things, that you can go to the minister, and the minister said, yeah, she didn't follow the regulation, she can't do that, you still have, you're not suspended. So we want to also apply that then. You can also appeal the conditions on a license or a cancellation of a license. It's just any of those regulatory tools that are applied. There is an appeal method through the minister. It requires I think it's a 15-day period to do the appeal. The in-person consultations, there were some concerns that the appeal is left to the minister alone. Some people suggested that it would be good to have a committee or some industry oversight of that. I guess the feedback I would have is that this government is in the process really of removing appeal committees in general, and that I don't think that that's something that would receive favor. There is the ability to appeal to the minister, though. Certainly the feedback, and that what we've heard about that concern will be brought forward for consideration. But I personally think it's unlikely that an appeal committee would be put in place. So any questions about that? Okay, well, this is one that was talked about yesterday a little bit by Plain. So right now, if there's a cervid of the same species that you're farming inside the fence is actively trying to gain entry, it's fighting across the fence, it's trying to breach the fence, it's inside your fenced off hay area, there is provisions that you can report to this conservation officer, but you could shoot it if it's sort of an immediate thing that you have to do. You could shoot it and then report it to a conservation officer, make sure that it's CWD tested, they'll look after it, but right now it's limited to the same species. So if you have deer inside the fence, it applies to a deer trying to gain access or gaining access. If it was an elk that broke in, you wouldn't have the authority to do that. So we're proposing that it apply to any of the cervid species, because we know as for CWD risk, it doesn't matter what species it is, so we just want to have that apply to all species. Now there is a corresponding piece in the Wildlife Act that would require changing down the road, so I think environment is generally in favor of this as far as CWD control, so they would have to agree to just a sort of a policy change on the short term until they can make the corresponding change on the Wildlife Act. But I think it makes sense for CWD control that it needs to apply to any cervid. So any questions or comments about that?
Does it have to be inside your fence or just trying to gain in and wrecking your fence?
Yeah, so if they're just sort of visiting across the fence, that's not enough, but if they're really going at the fence and trying to push it in, or if they've actually gained access, that's when it would apply. So we'll have to obviously flesh out some policy and clarity around that and communicate that out.
Just to be clear, if I've got a wild bull charging my fence, wrecking my fence, I will have the authority to shoot him and then call a conservation officer?
What do you think, Mike? I think so. If they're actually breaching the fence and putting the fence in danger, yes. Of the same species today, yeah.
So that is legal right now today, or that is the new change, same species?
My understanding is that should be accepted today. If they're actively trying to knock the fence over, you have the right to shoot it, report it right away, and they should come and submit it for CWD testing.
Thank you.
Okay. And again, this was well supported in the in-person consultations, and like I said, from the conversations we've had with environment up to this point on CWD control, they will be supportive. When the actual act change will happen, I don't know, but I'm hopeful that that's a go as well. So the last one was a new one that we added this time. It wasn't on the last consultation, but it's just to add a provision to prohibit altering or defacing an official tag, and it's just one of those things that you kind of assume is there, and I think people generally know that they're not to change a tag that's in an animal's ear, but it wasn't actually in our regulations, so just was something that was missing. So again, it's pretty clear in the regulations about lost tags and replacing tags and things like that. No plan to change any of that. It's just to actually take a marker and try to change a number on a tag or something like that. It's that's not allowed under the regulations, or won't be. So some other things. These weren't consulted on, but as we've been looking at doing some other changes to programs, we are looking at our mandatory surveillance program. It is included in the regulations. Not all of the details are in the regulations. Some of it's done in policy, and we can make some of those changes. But one thing that we would also like to propose is to allow for differences in requirements by operation type. So right now it says everybody, this might surprise you, is required to report a cervid death within 24 hours and to submit it for CWD testing within 15 days. Did you know the regulations say that? So what we would like to do is to be able to allow that that within policy, that we could make different testing deadline provisions for certain classes of animals. So where that would be is that perhaps in the future then we could have different submission criteria for hunt farms, for example, so that they wouldn't have to submit within 15 days, but they could submit, say, by the end of January, at the end of the hunt season, something like that. But right now, it was one of the things that was discussed in policy, but the way our regulations are written, we kind of don't have that flexibility. So I think having the ability to add that to regulations to give us future flexibility to amend that program as makes sense is something that we would like to do as well. So any comments or concerns with that? Okay. The other thing with the mandatory surveillance program, right now it says it applies to all cervids. The science says pretty clearly that fallow deer are not susceptible to CWD, so to continually say that fallow deer have to be tested doesn't make a lot of sense. So again, in that mandatory surveillance program, we could do an amendment there that says for this section does not apply to fallow deer.
Would that also change the ability then to move those animals into a place like Manitoba, for example? All other things, you know.
That would be Manitoba's, right? Manitoba sets their import policies, so. But I know that BC is fighting pretty hard to have fallow deer excluded from cervid movement permits if they're retained.
Yeah, well, the first one that comes to mind is slaughter.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I know there's at least one still large-scale fallow operation, and then they brought this up, you know, ability to move, like for example, into the federal plant in Manitoba.
Yeah. So again, Manitoba would have to recognize that, but I think there's certainly discussion at the federal level about removing fallow deer from some of the CWD requirements. So that may happen, but again, ultimately those import conditions into Manitoba are decided by Manitoba.
Great. Just might leverage them.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing that we're considering on the mandatory surveillance program is to look at changing inventory frequencies, and that's something we would do through policy. It's not, the regulations don't say the inventory frequency, but right now we are doing the annual inventories, as you know. Carlina explained, even on the certification program, that a paper inventory is allowed on alternate years once you get at certain levels. So, we think that perhaps for people that have been compliant, they're doing inventories, there's not a lot of reconciliation issues, that we could move to physical inventories every second year and paper inventories in between. That would allow us to perhaps divert some of our investigator work from annual inventories on fully compliant herds and moving those efforts to some of the herds that haven't been compliant and making sure that we get them back on inventories. If we're finding that we do every second year inventory and there's a huge mess in the inventories and it's really hard to reconcile, you're probably back to annual inventories. But for people that are able to reconcile and keep the inventories, we see that there could be some advantages to being able to do every second year. That said, if you still want an annual inventory because it's helpful with the herd certification program or things like that, we would still be willing to do that. So any concerns or questions on that? Okay. The other thing, and again, these were ones that weren't consulted on, but sort of have come up since the consultation was set out. I did mention that right now we just license game farms. There's no difference between hunt farms in any way. Some of the information or some of the CWD management tools say allow movement to slaughter or terminal premises. So I think I would like to see that hunt farms could be defined as terminal premises, or that we define terminal premises in the regulations as ones where no live animals leave. And so there may be some different movements that could be allowed onto those herds that maybe wouldn't be allowed to herds where live animals could continue to move from. So I think it just gives us flexibility in future CWD program management if we can define what premises we consider as terminal premises, and it would generally be the hunt farms. Any concerns about that or questions? Something I haven't considered? Okay. So next steps as far as the consultation. Consultation again open till April 15th, so if you haven't returned your written comments, please do so. If you're in agreement with them, sending paperback that says you are in agreement with them really helps us out. If the only ones who respond back are the ones that are opposed, that's the record we have. So it really does help us that if you are in support that you let us know, or if you're you're supportive 5 of them and not 2, again still let us know. It does help that process. So then we again consider the input through the in-person consultations and through the written ones, and develop the draft regulations, and that's some of the fun that Trent will be having over the next few months, is drafting the new regulations. They then go to a cabinet committee and cabinet for approval, and we hope to have them in place by the end of this year. So anything else about the regulatory changes? Okay. So the other one that was mentioned was information on the provincial CWD response. And I know there's been a bit of frustration that we don't have an official response or a final CWD response. We have a draft response program in effect, which is essentially what I presented at your meeting last year. The goal is to limit spread to new areas of the province or from positive farms locally. So if herds with CWD are outside of CFIA control action, the province is responding, but we are not ordering animals destroyed, we're not paying compensation, we're looking at movement controls and controlled movement to try to limit the spread of CWD. So CWD is a provincially notifiable animal disease and a designated disease, and the controls that we would use, a positive herd gets a designated disease notice and no movements on or off without a movement authorization from the ministry. So we determine kind of what animals can come on and off. And then it's really up to the producer to manage CWD on farm. We've got 2 active positive farms right now that are continuing to operate. I told the first one that was infected, I guess the good news is you get to decide how to manage it on farm. The bad news is you get to decide how to manage it on farm. We're not, other than we control the movements, we're not saying what you do. Slaughter remains an option. We'll assist with getting animals to slaughter. Now that live testing is an option, we'll help out where we can for live testing. Help explore options and can provide some input as far as risk assessment and some options and choices, but it really is your choice right now. And I fully recognize that your options are very limited, especially with really slaughter being either slaughter or harvest of velvet followed by slaughter to confirm negative, so that then that velvet can be sold. So it's velvet sale without a corresponding death and a CWD test is going to be really, really difficult, because CFIA still does control movement of animal products off the farm, and you won't be able to sell velvet without a negative CWD test to validate it from a positive farm.
And hunt, right? And still be able to hunt as well.
Yes, so I'll talk about the movement to hunt on my next slide, if that's okay. Sorry, somebody else had a question.
Yeah. Would you allow one of those farms to move to a hunt ranch if a hunt ranch wanted a bull or something?
So that is one that I'll talk about in the next slide. It's somewhat up in flux. Would I personally, if it was totally just up to me, yes, but we have a we need a provincial overall plan, and so that's still to be determined. So-
When you talk about movement to a slaughter facility, will that be ones with inspection only, or will that be allowed to ones with health certificates on them?
So ones that are health licensed within the province, that would be possible, though that meat can only be used within the province then. And we would have to have enough oversight to make sure that the head was collected and for CWD testing, and have to do a bit of a program ahead of time to make sure that the carcass could be isolated and separated from other carcasses and held until the CWD results are back.
So what you're telling me is that you would be able to send an inspector to one of these places?
We could send a,
Or a representative, we won't use the word inspector, let's say representative then.
yes, we could use our meat safety supervisor, food safety specialist who looks after the meat program.
Correct.
Could go out to the plant and discuss how they could manage and hold the carcass. And we'd probably use like Renee or Mike to go and actually collect the head and make sure it got tested.
Very good, that was something I was angling for.
Yeah, the food center who does our domestic program inspection will not go out to a health license plant and do inspections there. So if it's one of the domestic plants that we oversee, then it's really easy because we've got all the protocols in place. But if it's a health license plant, that'll take a little bit more effort. But we would work to help facilitate that.
Okay. We've got some special cases to work with on there, so
Yeah.
I'll be speaking with you about that more.
Yeah.
And I apologize for just walking in. Maybe this has been answered. Stop.
Yes, it's already been answered. Sorry.
You're not going to make this hard.
With Alberta having the latest case in the Innisfree area and 330 more positives in the wild, basically in a quarter between Saskatchewan and the two federal plants there, is there any will on yourself, Department of Ag in Saskatchewan, to reopen negotiations with Alberta, put some pressure on them so it isn't so ridiculously hard to get animals to slaughter?
Well, as far as I know, Fort McLeod is still in a free area.
Okay, but Lacombe isn't.
Yeah.
We can take everything that is a special case of Lacombe, that's no problem.
We have discussions with them about the processes. I'm frankly been pretty pleased with how flexible they've been and what animals they've been taking. I know the conditions are stringent with the identification, but we're getting herds in there for slaughter. We haven't had like sort of outright refusal. As long as we can follow the conditions, we're at least getting them in there.
But the need to collar a herd that has never had a positive, simply, you can have a herd that has an 85% head submission, and it would have to be collared to get in there.
No, not necessarily. That modified
most
appendix,
cases.
like we've had, there's been quite a few of those modified that have been accepted this
Okay,
past
you
couple
could
of
have
years as well.
a herd that had 50% of its heads submitted and it wouldn't get in without
That's
collars.
probably true, yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
They're endemic. 15 years had a case of a truck losing an animal or
Yeah.
having a wreck or anything.
Yeah. All right, so the sort of is the reason why we're still in a draft policy that we're working from and things aren't finalized is we're working toward a One Health CWD management plan for Saskatchewan. What we mean by One Health, we've got a One Health committee that involves the Ministries of Health, Ministries of Environment, and Ministries of Agriculture, working together on a number of different files. Rabies, for example, some other antimicrobial resistance and stewardship are other ones. But one of the priorities for this year is the CWD management plan for Saskatchewan. Know that one of the issues with dealing with the disease is that sometimes all the partners don't agree, and sometimes working at cross purposes. So to get everybody working together on a plan that we can all agree with is the goal here. So we're making progress. We've had 4 or 5 meetings. We've got another one, I think, next week, working on management. I was quite pleased to hear Ega from Environment say yesterday about needing new approaches and working on control of CWD. I think it has to be recognized eradication is not an option on either side of the fence, really, in Saskatchewan. So how do we live with it? How do we manage it? How can we work on say cervid health rather than focusing totally on disease? That said, to date, Environment has been fairly uncomfortable with the continued operation of positive farms. They recognize that is the policy that we have, and that's what we're working on. But they're not real comfortable with it. So I think one of the things that will be discussed on the overall management strategy is, will it depend where they are, whether it's an endemic area or an area where it hasn't been identified in wildlife. And you all saw the map. I think the areas where it hasn't been identified in wildlife are getting smaller and smaller. Ega also, I think, spoke well about the potential risk to caribou. And we have mapped out a caribou buffer zone of 100 kilometers across the north, where they would be looking at some differences in response on wildlife management, but would we also be looking at some differences in response on game farms in those areas. So that's something that's still under discussion. The movement of positive or animals from a positive farm to a hunt farm. To me, a hunt farm is a terminal premises, especially if it's in an endemic area. It's no different than slaughter. I don't see that there's a big risk in spread of CWD if an animal from a positive farm moves to a hunt farm and it's killed and tested in 6 months. I don't think that that's a big risk. Again, there is some discomfort on that from Environment right now, and we're getting to those nitty-gritty details. I'll be fighting really hard for it because I can't see from a disease point of view why we wouldn't.
I have a question about that. So, obviously they're going to have discomfort about anything about this because, so what does that mean? So when you're referring to Environment having discomfort about this, we know they have discomfort about us being a deer farm healthy.
Yeah.
So how does that, how does that come into play when you're sitting in negotiation with them when it doesn't matter what science you come up with, they're going to be uncomfortable with it?
Yeah. We're going to have some difficult conversations, and it's ultimately will be a government decision, right? It'll be the overall government that makes the decision.
Okay. I maybe, and I might be naive to how these decisions are made. So you represent agriculture, environment, and obviously they're in play and everything, but why don't we just tell them what we're doing? And with, long and short of it, suck it up.
And I'll just say that we're putting forward our case fairly vigorously.
Thank you.
I want to make a comment. I think what Environment has to get over is that if we have a case of CWD on a farm, that it didn't come from just another farm. That it right now most likely came from other side. And we agree on that, but there is a perception amongst wildlife people, not just here, and as I found out in other parts of the country, that if it's on a farm, it came from a farm, and therefore it's going to leave the farm. Not the other way around, that it's on the farm, it came from outside in, and it's already something that's in wildlife. Tell them not, don't polish their halos too much here.
No, I think we've been pretty strong, and I think there's published papers from CFIA that the cases that have occurred since 2005, the source has not generally been from movement of farm cervids. It's been other sources, whether it's feed or suspected from wildlife or something undetermined, but not related to farm cervid movement. There's been the odd one that has, but the majority have not been.
My point is that message isn't sinking in with them.
If a hunt farm comes up with a positive, do you have any plans on putting any restrictions on?
If what?
Well, if a hunt farm comes up with a positive, do you have any plans of putting any restrictions?
Here we get a designated disease notice, and movement would require a permit. Animal movement would require a permit.
So that you could leave them out there year round? It's just, there's no restrictions by you or CFIA anymore then?
As it is right now, yes. So I think in the future, as we develop this provincial plan, it may end up depending on what area of the province it's in. So there maybe if it's in the buffer zone, maybe there'll have to be an annual depopulation and start over fresh each year or something like that.
What do you call in the buffer zone?
What that is
It's not the start of the forest, though, eh?
No, it does, actually most of that, a lot of the positives in the Torch River area, Nipawin Love area, a lot of that is included in the buffer zone. It goes up quite a bit more in the northwest. I can share a map with you guys later, but they're looking at the traditional boreal caribou range and then adding 100 kilometers onto it. And so they'll be looking at controls, and again, without concurrent controls on the wildlife side, we would not be looking at additional farm controls, right? They need to be in concert, and that's why it needs to be an agreed upon provincial plan. Like having controls on game farms in that area, but not doing anything to control densities or baiting or something like that in those areas, it's not going to be effective. It needs to be everything looked at together. Okay. So the hunt farm. So that's again. So we were. Sheila had been working with you guys on a hunt farm policy. I agree with the concept and the purpose of the policy. That's one of the things that why we want to change the regulations around the surveillance program to allow some different submission standards for say a terminal premises, so that you don't need to submit every within 15 days, but that it could be a submission at the end of a season. Again, I think the continued operation of hunt farms is important to agriculture. It's important to a lot of the economy, and I think that the risks, the CWD risks, can be managed. So I'm hopeful that we'll come up with a policy that's livable there.
I just have one more comment that I know I've made to you before that I want everybody else here to be thinking about is
Harley's bringing your mic.
that a lot of these. So one thing that I would like people to be thinking about, if you haven't already, and I know I've talked about this with Betty in some of our meetings, is that, and my caution when we're making new rules applying to this stuff, we have to somehow have I'll use your word, buffer, for when we've cured this, or when we've got a fix for it. Because I mean, if you got anything out of yesterday, there's a lot of science and a lot of excitement about being poured into CWD. If these rules are already in place, we already know environment doesn't like us, and they're going to use, in the future, if we put all these rules on us, are these going to be able to be just as easily removed? I don't know how that works or what that looks like, but I sort of think this is sort of when we're talking about controlling the disease now, it's a for literally now, not necessarily for tomorrow.
Yeah. So for any of the diseases we respond to, we get the authorities through the Act and the regulations, and they say what tools we can use, and like ordering cleaning disinfection or ordering a quarantine or whatever. The rules say what tools you have, but the actual disease control policy is a policy document, and it's fluid, and it can adjust.
So, for example, these scientists go home tomorrow and phone us in a month from now saying that we've got the vaccination for it.
you know, all this, you know, say restrictions with farms that had CWD that are now going to be able to vaccinate for it or otherwise wouldn't be so restrictive in movement or otherwise. They would just be able to apply those, a new set of rules to the same, or change it again.
Yeah, you'd have to look at what the, you know, look at that vaccine and what the policies are, and
I know
you know,
there's a lot to
and
it,
so you could, for example, say all animals moving on have to be vaccinated 3 weeks ahead or whatever, and have some sort of protocol in place to show it, or like you could set that. Yeah. So import protocols, people will know that the import protocol into the province is very badly out of date. It dates from 2004. We've tried a couple of times to do the update. The import protocol has to be done with environment. It's a joint import protocol that assesses the risks of introduction of diseases into the province. We've thought for a long time that some of the imports related to CWD may not be that relevant. Certainly some of the other diseases, brainworm, some of the other ones are Bisnoidia. There's a few that are just not current and need to be updated. It's still on the list for an update, but again, that the CWD policy takes precedence over that right now. One of the things that in the import protocol right now that bothers me quite a bit is that we can't allow movement onto a CWD positive or trace out herd. It says in our import protocol that can't happen. My first attempt at getting environment to agree to not applying that protocol was not accepted, but as we get down into, again, these next meetings and the nitty-gritty, again, I don't know what disease risk it adds, so that's one that we'll be pushing real hard on. So that's why I have a few hesitations on the continued operation of hunt farms when they're positive. Yes, I think they should be able to. Right now, we would not get sign-off to import an animal from Alberta to a positive hunt farm, so that's not very useful in continuing to operate. So that we know that needs to be addressed, and from a disease control point of view, I don't think that adds any value or disease control. So we'll be pushing hard to have that changed. And then highly contaminated premises. So I've been reading a lot of documents lately related to CWD, but think about the voluntary herd certification program now becomes the HCP, and in my mind HCP is highly contaminated premises, which is kind of the opposite of the herd program. So it's a bit of acronym problem. So we'll be trying to change all our documents referring to these to high-risk premises instead, so that we can distinguish them. But you'll may or may not remember that when CFIA changed their program April 1st, they have declarations of infected place on 33 Saskatchewan premises that were deemed to be highly contaminated or high risk for CWD. They had a requirement that the fences be maintained to exclude wild cervids. April 1st, they decided that although they couldn't remove the declaration of infected place, they were not going to maintain the quarantine requirements around fencing. The province was uncomfortable with just having all those fences removed without doing an appropriate risk assessment. So we replaced all those federal quarantines with the provincial quarantine, requiring producers to maintain the fence to exclude wild cervids while we developed a process to assess them. So that process has been developed. Took a fair bit of time, but the process looks at is CWD endemic in the wild cervids around that premises. So first of all, looks has there been detections of chronic wasting disease within 25 kilometers of the farm. And then, is there enough wild surveillance to be able to determine a prevalence in the area? And if the prevalence in wildlife is high enough, then it's considered an endemic area. And then if the cleaning and disinfection was completed and it's been at least 5 years and you're not in the buffer zone, then those restrictions, then the fence could be removed. If you're in the buffer zone, cleaning and disinfection has to have occurred at least 10 years before. So we know that there's persistence in the environment, so it's just a greater sense of caution in that buffer zone. When the conditions to maintain the fence are removed, there's still going to be, at least in the short term, conditions to prevent baiting or other attractants. So don't want to have the owner of the property actively encourage cervids to come onto the premises, because we still no way to reliably measure the degree of contamination on the site. So we've been through about half the herds now, and we'll be working on letters and quarantine modifications to a bunch of those premises, and then we'll work through the rest of them in May. But there is a process, and again, the flow chart is a little complicated right now, so we're just trying to simplify it, and then we'll make that public as well, so that it's clear what the process is.
When you released the quarantines on some of that land, will you issue another license?
That will be part of the consideration. So far, we have not been. We had removed the ability to restock those with farm cervids. It'll be one of the things under that overall provincial policy that we do need to look at. Some of those would be, for example, ideal to, say, be a research place to see how long they are still contaminated.
Yeah,
and some of the operators have expressed an interest in being involved in that kind of research.
Yeah, or even just for whatever reason, to do a hunt on, to store some bulls, to...
Yeah, and so, again, I think...
land is pretty low infection.
Yeah. Well, no, these ones, well, some of them, yeah. Some of them are pretty high, too. Like, some of them were 70%
But if
positive.
you're going to let farms operate after being positive,
yeah.
I mean, why wouldn't you, how can you refuse a license to somebody that's got the fencing facility there?
Yeah, so on those high-risk ones, then you could look at things similar to the conditions CFIA had for hunt farms on highly contaminated premises, where animals, again, were licensed on for a season and had to be shot within 6 months and tested. So that sort of management. So again, it's still the overall policy is still under discussion, and we need to make sure that everything is in alignment and makes sense across the board. Yeah, I don't disagree with you. We need to look at that and make sure it makes sense given the policy of allowing herds to operate. Yeah. All right. So is that I do have some statistics, but maybe in the interest of time, if somebody wants to, I could maybe share them with the SCA website or something like that. Or do you really want to see some of the statistical numbers for the year? Yeah.
We can put it on the website.
Okay.